Okay, let's talk about America and Iran. When you hear those two names together, what pops into your head? I bet it's tension, right? Conflict, headlines, maybe even the threat of war. But what if I told you that for most of their history, the story was the complete opposite? Today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating, almost totally forgotten history of friendship and, believe it or not, mutual admiration between two countries we now see as enemies. So let's dive right in. And we're not going to start at the beginning. We're going to start at a party, probably the most over-the-top party of the 20th century. The year is 1971. We're at the ancient ruins of Persepolis, and the Shah of Iran is throwing this massive bash to celebrate 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy. And this picture, this moment, it really captures the absolute peak of the friendship between Iran and the West. And when I say over the top, I am not kidding. Get this. The guest list had 10 kings and 16 presidents. The legendary restaurant Maxim's of Paris literally shut down for 2 weeks just to cater the event. They flew in 22 tons of supplies from France, and the menu, it was just insane. We're talking quail eggs stuffed with caviar, roasted peacocks stuffed with foie gras. I mean, come on. This was way more than just a party. It was a huge statement about Iran's solid gold alliance with America. And this feeling that the alliance was permanent, it was everywhere. As late as December 1977, that's just a year before the revolution exploded, President Jimmy Carter was in Tehran raising a glass to the Shah and calling Iran an island of stability. At that moment, you would have thought this friendship was literally set in stone. And then, poof, in what felt like a blink of an eye, it was all gone. The Peacock Throne, the King of Kings, that whole 2,500-year-old empire they celebrated at that crazy party, just vanished. The Shah was out, his country was turned completely upside down. I mean, it is just a shocking turn of events. How does an island of stability completely shatter almost overnight? That's the big question. And to get the answer, we have to look really carefully at where we decide to start the story. And that's the whole problem, you see. Our entire understanding of this relationship is all twisted up because we almost always start the story at the very end, right at the moment when everything fell apart. Now, check this out, because this is where it gets really interesting. You've got two completely different starting points. For most Americans, the story kicks off in 1979. Revolutionaries storm the U.S. Embassy. That's seen as the original sin of Iran, the birth of this deep anti-American feeling. But for tons of Iranians, the story starts way earlier, in 1953, with America's original sin, the CIA-backed coup that got rid of their democratic leader and put the Shah in charge as a dictator. Each side points to the other's starting point as the moment it all went bad. But here's the big twist. What if both of those events aren't beginnings at all? What if they're actually endings? The last tragic chapters of a much, much longer and surprisingly positive story that we've pretty much completely forgotten. All right, so let's rewind. Let's rewind way back. The real relationship actually started centuries ago. Back in the 1720s, before the United States was even a country, colonial newspapers in places like Boston were just obsessed with news from the Persian Empire. Then, a few decades later, you have the founding fathers themselves studying Persian history. And by the 1830s, the first Americans are showing up in Persia, not as soldiers, but as missionaries building schools and hospitals. This early American fascination is just wild. These colonial newspapers were passionately rooting for Persia. And why? Well, it was pretty simple. They saw Persia as a rival to the Ottoman Empire, who they saw as a major threat. For early Americans, it boiled down to, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And get this is how deep the connection went. For generations, American 5-year-olds learned their ABCs from this book called the New England Primer. And when they got to the letter X, what did they learn about? Xerxes, the ancient Persian king. So Persia wasn't some strange, faraway place. It was baked right into the culture of early America. And look, this wasn't just some fun fact in a school book. The very guys who designed the American Republic, we're talking Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, they looked to ancient Persian emperors like Cyrus the Great as models for how to be a just and wise leader. Jefferson owned 2 copies of a biography of Cyrus. Adams was writing notes in his. They actually saw something in Persian history worth admiring and learning from. Okay, so America was fascinated with Persia. But what about the other way around? Well, Persia's interest in America came a bit later, and honestly, it was for much more practical and urgent reasons. So in the 1800s, Persia was getting squeezed. big time. You had Britain and Russia basically playing this great game for control of the region, and Persia was stuck in the middle. They forced Persia to sign these horrible treaties called capitulations, and these deals basically gave European countries total economic control, and it meant their citizens couldn't even be put on trial for crimes they committed in Persia. It was totally crippling and humiliating.
So you can imagine they're trapped between these two huge empires. Persia started desperately looking for a third force, some other powerful country that could be a friend, an ally, without trying to take everything. And a country that was born from a revolution against a European empire, well, that sounded like the perfect candidate. They started looking towards America.
And remember, those American missionaries, they weren't government agents. They were building up this huge reserve of goodwill by setting up schools and hospitals that people really needed. You even had figures like Mario Hanan, the guy in this picture, touring the U.S. back in the 1840s. It was a connection built between people and cultures, not just governments.
So when you piece all of this forgotten history back together, a totally different story comes into focus. For more than 100 years, long before any coups or revolutions that we all know about, the story of America and Iran was actually one of mutual fascination, of deep respect, and this genuine feeling that they were natural allies.
The author of our source material, John Ghazvinian, he sums it up perfectly. He says, what emerges is a portrait of two countries with far more in common than they care to admit. You know, this lost history is a really powerful reminder that the way things are now isn't the way they've always been, or the way they have to be. It's actually a pretty recent break from a much longer history of friendship. It leaves you with a big question. If these two nations could find so much common ground for so long, have we all just forgotten where their story really began?